Good morning, everyone.
Morning. No, you just no, that's not what you told me. But I'll tell you, we'll talk later.
Okay, we're on DAF Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. And yesterday...
What was your set?
Of course.
Menachem Mendel.
Neshama should have an aliyah. Yesterday, we were mentioning that the rabbis had this very precise agricultural knowledge that when something grows a third of its way, then it's already subject to, that determines its point of growth, whereby we say that it belongs to the year of where it's grown a third of its way. So if it grew a third of its way before Rosh HaShana, this is referring to grain, grapes, and olives. If it grew a third of its way before Rosh Hashanah, it belongs to the old year. If it doesn't grow a third of its way before Rosh Hashanah, only after Rosh Hashanah, it belongs to the new year, vis-a-vis Trumas, Maasros, and Shemitah. The Gemara also displays a great knowledge of agriculture by saying that, and this was based on the Psukim as well, that the reason why the Sukkos after the Shemitah year is considered to be part of the Shemitah year by the Torah is because it's talking about the produce that is harvested on Sukkos that actually grew a third of its way before Rosh Hashanah. So Chazal knew that when something is 15 days before it's grown a third of its way with grain, then it's ready for harvest on Sukkos 15 days later. So the Gemara now says, Amar le Rabbi Yirmiyah le Reb Zera, which is about the 7th or 8th line. V'kimlahu l'Rabbanan ben shlish l'pachos mishlish. Were the rabbis so well versed that they could tell you with absolute certainty that if something is harvested on Sukkos, then it grew a third of its way before Rosh Hashanah? The rabbis know so precisely when something's grown a third of its way versus when it hasn't yet grown a third of its way. So Amar Lei, so he said back to him, so Reb Zera said back to Rabbi Yirmiyah, La v'amina lach lo sapik nafshach lebar mehilchasa. I've already told you before, don't remove your soul outside of the halacha. Now what that means is, according to Rashi, is don't cast aspersions on the rabbis' halachic knowledge, where they provided us with measurements, sizes, volumes, time spans that are based upon a precise understanding of reality, a precise understanding of either agriculture or other kinds of physical realities that they need to know in order to determine the proper halacha. Because kol midos chachamim kenhu, all measurements of Chazal are based on knowledge of the reality. So, for example, be'arboim sa hu tovel, be'arboim sa chasr kortov, eno yachol litbol behen. That the rabbis knew with certainty that the average human body is able to immerse itself completely in 40 sa'as of water. And therefore, 40 sa'as minus even like a little ounce of water would not be a kosher mikveh. And that's the basis why. How did Chazal know that a kosher mikveh is 40 sa'as of water? Because they measured and they determined that the average size male human being needs 40 sa'as in order for his body to be completely immersed. Another example, Kebeitza metame tumas ochlin, Kebeitza chasur shum shum eno metame tumas ochlin. The rabbis also knew when the Torah says mikol ha'ochel asher ye'achel, that food items are subject to receiving tumah, and we learn from the language that you have to be able to eat them with one swallow, those kinds of foods, and therefore only foods that are large enough to be one kibetza or larger are subject to being makabel tumah, because a kibetza, the size of a kibetza, is something that you could swallow in one gulp, in one swallow. So therefore, only foods that are of that size or larger are makabel tumah. Another example, so therefore if it's the size of an egg minus a little sesame seed size of deficiency, then that's not going to be makabel tumah. Shlosha al shlosha metame midras, shlosha al shlosha chasr nima echas ena metame midras. Another example of this is that the rabbis knew, the Torah talks about fabric being able to be makabel tumah by a zav, either sitting or standing on it. And they said, well, it has to be a type of fabric which has a utility for sitting or for standing, like a mat or of some kind. The rabbis knew that a piece of fabric that's 3 by 3 tefachim has a utility. Anything less than that size, even a thread size, does not have that utility, and therefore their knowledge is extremely precise. Now, of course, the point I believe of the Gemara is that the rabbinic psak, as far as the size and volume and things like that stops on a dime. It's absolutely precise. You can't say that, well, sometimes it's more than a third, sometimes it's less than a third, sometimes it's bigger than an egg, sometimes it's smaller than it. Halacha doesn't work that way. The halachic system is always precise, even though it uses the laws of averages to get to these measurements. But that's the way Chazal understood the halachic system. So Hadar Amr Rabbi Yirmiyah Lav Milsehi da Amri. And Rav Yirmiyah himself relented and said it was inappropriate for me to even ask or to even present this challenge in the first place. Debo minei chavraya me Rav Kahana. As the other members of the Beis Medrash had challenged Rav Kahana and asked him, Omer shehikrivu Yisrael b'chenisasin la'aretz mehichan hikrivu. So the question they asked him was, the Korban HaOmer, that the Jewish people, upon entry into Eretz Yisrael, after Moshe Rabbeinu's death, remember, Moshe Rabbeinu died in what month? Adar. When did the Jewish people cross the Jordan? A month and 3 days later, on the 10th of Nisan. Okay? So they come into Eretz Yisrael on the 10th of Nisan. They've run out of mun. There may be a little bit of mun left, but for all intents and purposes, the mun is run out. They need food. Okay? Where are they going to get grain from if it's chadash? Everything is chadash. And you have to bring a korban ha'omer on the 16th in order to be able to eat grain. So you'll say for 6 days they'll subsist on fruits and vegetables, right? That they don't have to have grain, they don't have to have bread, okay? Because there's a problem of chadash, of having the new grain until the 16th of Nisan. But where did they get the barley to offer the korban ha'omer? Im tomer da'al bi'ad nachri kitzirchem amarachman v'lo kitzir nachri. So how, if you're going to tell me that they took grain that had already been growing in the possession of a non-Jew, the Torah says, no, that's not going to work because it's kitzirchem. It has to be your harvest. It has to be planted and grown by you. So the Gemara says, Mimai de akrivu, dilma lo akrivu. So the Gemara says, how do you know that the first year they brought the korban ha'omer? Maybe they didn't bring it at all the first year. So the Gemara says, Lo sal kedayim, dichsiv vayochlu me avur haaretz mimacharas haPesach. The pasuk in Yehoshua says that after they passed over the land, they ate from the produce of the land on the day after Pesach. So, mimacharas haPesach achol meikar lo ochel de akrivu omer. Why did they just only start eating the produce of the land after the first day of Pesach? It must be because they were waiting to bring the korban omer, v'hadar achli. So first they brought the korban omer and then they ate it. We see that from the pasuk. So mehechan hikrivu. So where did they bring the korban omer? Amar lahen. So Rav Kahana told them, Kol shalohevi shlish biyad nachri. He told them it's okay as long as they found barley that had already been planted, as long as it hadn't yet sprouted a third of its way. It's still called kitzirchem. It's still called your harvest because it's not reached that maturity of 1/3 of its way, and it's then if it comes at that point in the possession of a Jew, it's all right. So v'dilma ayel v'lo kimlahu. So the question that Rabbi Yirmiyah says, you see from this whole discussion that maybe it had already grown a third of its way, and the rabbis of the time, the leaders of the time, did not know precise agricultural measurements. So ella kimlahu. So you have to conclude that they knew. They knew to take possession of a barley plant that had not yet grown a third of its way, and therefore they knew exactly. So you have to say, so hachanami kimlahu. And therefore the rabbis here too are absolutely certain that if fully grown grain is harvested on Sukkot, then it reaches a third of its growth before Rosh HaShana. So the Gemara says, "V'dilma lo ayel klal, aval hecha da ayel riva ben shlish lepachos mishlish lo kimlahu." But the Gemara says, "But wait a minute, that's not a raya. Maybe when they came into Eretz Yisrael, they had not that they had found an immature barley plant, but they just found nothing, and they planted seeds right away. Maybe that's what we're talking about. And perhaps if they had found a barley plant that had grown a fourth of its way, they would not be able to distinguish between a plant that had grown a third of its way or not, right? So they wouldn't know the difference. How can you prove from there? Maybe when they came into Eretz Yisrael, they planted barley and fartik. So the Gemara says, "Lo sal kedaitach." That's not possible. Dichsiv v'ha'am alu min hayarden be'asar lachodesh, because it says in the pasuk in Yehoshua that they came into, they passed over the Jordan on the 10th of Nisan. They come into Eretz Yisrael on the 10th of Nisan. V'yisal kedaitach delo ayel klal b'chamisha yomi mikamalya. How could you suggest that a freshly planted barley plant could grow in 5 days to be harvestable on the 16th of Nisan and be able to bear barley kernels. That's not possible. So Elamai da'il riva odanka. So what are you going to tell me? So that it grew a fourth of the way? It grew a less than a third of the way in the hands of a Gentile. So it grew a fourth of the way. It grew a little bit less than a fourth of the way. But akati b'chamisha yomi mika malia. But still, how could it grow to maturity in just 5 days? So Ela ma yislach lemeimar eretz tzvi ksivba hachanami eretz tzvi ksivba. So you have to say, we know that the pasuk calls Eretz Yisrael the land of the deer, D-E-E-R, meaning that a tzvi is the swiftest of animals. So too, the growths of Eretz Yisrael are precocious and they grow very rapidly. And that's what must have happened here as well. So Tosfos asks the obvious question: if the growths of Eretz Yisrael are precocious, then how could you know that if something's harvestable on Sukkot, that it must have grown a third of its way 15 days earlier? Maybe it grew rapidly after Rosh HaShana, after a third of its way. So Tosfos, the very bottom Tosfos, makes an interesting point. He says there's a fundamental difference between fully mature grain that's harvestable on Sukkot and very moist and sort of green barley kernels that are growing in the spring. Those kinds of barley kernels could grow after it's already grown a third of its way, or a little bit less than a third of its way, in 5 days could reach a certain level of growth such that you could harvest those very fresh green barley kernels. But that's not called full maturity. That's just the minimum that you would need to have barley kernels growing so that you could bring the korban ha'omer. But what we're talking about previously is a fully mature wheat plant that's growing in the fall. That's something that could only, if you see on Sukkot it's at full maturity, it must have reached a third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah. There's another interesting question that is raised by a previous Tosfos, and that is, we're assuming over here that they only started eating grain on the 16th of Nisan. What did they do about matzah that year? What did they do at the Seder? What kind of matzah did they eat? If they couldn't have chadash, right, what did they do? So the Tosfos cites from the Gemara Yerushalmi two possible answers. One is that they held a mitzvahs aseh docha los aseh, that a positive commandment of eating matzah overrides the negative commandment of chadash. And an alternative answer, because there's an opinion that says that you cannot say that, says that they bought that small amount that they needed because they only needed a kazayas of flour for the night of the Seder, so that small amount they could buy from the non-Jews that were there. And there's no isser of chadash if the flour is owned by non-Jews. They must have purchased it from them. Okay, in any event, maskef la Rabbi Chanina, umi matzis amart dahayosiv katzirhu. Now we're going back to the pasuk that we cited yesterday. I just want to review that. The Gemara had said, how do you know that something that is harvestable on Sukkot grew a third of its way on before Rosh Hashanah? Because it says the word asif twice. The verb to gather is mentioned twice in the context of Chag HaSukkos. It says v'chag ha'asif b'tzeis hashana be'asbechas ma'asecha min hasadeh, that the holiday of gathering at the end of the year, when you gather your farming from the field. Why does it have to say gathering twice? One is to tell you that the holiday is at the time of gathering in the fall, and the other word asbecha is not meant to teach you gathering, but rather harvesting. And it's telling you that when you harvest grain, it's from the previous year. That's what it's telling you, because that's why it's called at the end of the year. It's telling you that the grain that you're harvesting, that your kotzer, that you're harvesting on Sukkot, comes from the end of the previous year. So the Gemara's question is, how can you say that that's how you transpose the word from asif to katzir? We have another pasuk that tells us that Sukkot is supposed to be celebrated at a time when you're gathering in your goren and your yakev, all of your produce from the field. And we had learned that the reason why the Torah indicates to us that Sukkot is celebrated at the gathering time, at the in-gathering time, is not only to tell you when seasonally it's celebrated, but also to teach you what materials are supposed to be used to construct your sukkah. And what are you supposed to use? Those materials that you gather in that are the waste product of the actual produce, such as the straw and the chaff and the hay, that is the byproduct of all of the things that are growing out in the field. And that's what you're supposed to make the schach out of. So therefore the Gemara says, I could very easily read the additional word asif in the pasuk not as talking about harvesting, but rather telling you the reason why you need the second word asif is the first word asif is to tell you when you're supposed to celebrate Sukkot. The second word asif in the pasuk is coming to tell you what materials you're supposed to use to construct the schach. And that's the reason for it, not to tell you about wheat that grows that's harvested on Sukkot grew from the previous year. So Amar Reb Zera Hamilsa Havoy Biyadan Vasa Rabbi Chanina Shada Beinarga. So Reb Zera sort of like, you can just imagine him shaking his head morosely. He says, we had nailed this a moment ago, and Reb Zera comes along and threw a wrench in the whole thing. Like we had such a beautiful explanation, and comes along Reb Zera and he threw a wrench in the whole thing, and now we got to start all over again and figure out how we know that when something is harvested on Sukkot, it already grew 15 days before from the previous year. So Taka, how do you know that?
Is it a common expression in the Gemara? Throwing an axe?
Not sure. Shada Beinarga. I think it does appear a few places. You look at the footnote, it says that it appears, where else does it appear? No, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Throwing a wrench.
Yeah, not sure. Ela minolan. So from where do we know this? Kedatanya Reb Yonasan ben Yosef Omer. So really, we're actually going back to our original question. The question, therefore, now is not how do you know that something that is harvested on Sukkot grew a third of its way before Rosh HaShana. That we're not even going to be dealing with anymore. Because really, the original thing that we wanted to verify is the Gemara had made a statement that when we're dealing with tithes that are subject to Deoraisa tithing, namely grain, olives, grapes, those three kinds of produce, the halacha is that once they reach a third of their maturity, they count from the year of when that maturity was achieved. So the Gemara had said, we know this because Sukkot is called the end of the previous year because the produce that grows then, right, that's harvested then, grew a third of its way before Rosh Hashanah. So you see, a third of the growth is the criterion for when it's considered to be mature. So the Gemara says we can't use that drasha anymore. So now the question really is: so how taka do you know that when something reaches a third of its growth, it's considered to be grown for purposes of which year it belongs to? So really, the answer is from the following pasuk: Ve'as is atvua l'shlosh hashana. We just read this in Parshas Bahar, where it talks about Shemitah. The Torah says, "V'chi somru manochal b'shana hashvius." You may ask the question, what are we going to eat during the seventh year if we can't plant and we can't harvest and we can't work the soil and so forth? So what are we going to do? So the Torah says, don't worry, I will give forth my blessing on the sixth year, which will produce a yield of 3 years. For year 6, for year 7, and for year 8. So the Gemara says, Al tikri l'shalosh ela l'shlish. Do not read it as 3 years, but rather as shlish, but rather as a third. And really what this pasuk is indicating is that once grain grows a third of its growth, it's considered to be grown. And that's considered to be its year. That year that it grew a third of its growth is the year that it belongs to. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, v'hami boy le legufe. You need the pasuk to tell you the message. The message is that there'll be a blessing in the 6th year for 3 years. How can you now take that out of its pshat if you need that message for itself? The Gemara says, Ksiv krach rina, because we have another pasuk that indicates that message. What does the pasuk say? Uzeratem es hashana hashminis va'achaltem en atvua yashan ad hashana hatashiyas. The Torah says, don't worry about Shemitah because you'll plant in the 8th year and you'll still be eating from the old grain from year 6 until year 9. In other words, until you're ready to harvest the planting from year 8. So don't worry, the Torah says. So if you already have that pasuk, what do you need this pasuk? It's coming for the drasha to tell you, don't read it as shalosh, but read it as shlish, that once it's grown a third of its way, it's considered to be part of that year. Tanan hasa. Now we're going to go back to our discussion of when is something considered to have reached maturity. So if you recall, we said that when it comes to grain, olives, and grapes, it's a third of its growth. When it comes to vegetables, we said the criterion is when what? When you harvest it, when you actually harvest it. When it comes to trees, what is the criterion? When it starts to blossom, okay? When it starts to I think chanat is when it starts to blossom or bud. Is when it's considered to be part of that year. And by the way, with trees, the cutoff date is not Rosh HaShana like fruits and other fruits and vegetables, but it's rather anything that grows on a tree. The cutoff date is what? Tu B'Shvat. So that if it started growing, the chanata started happening before Tu B'Shvat, it's part of the previous year. If the chanata happened after Tu B'Shvat, it's considered to be part of the next year. Fine, and that criteria, why is that criterion relevant? Because if you have some fruits that grew before Tu B'Shvat, some fruits that grew after Tu B'Shvat, you cannot tie them together. You have to tithe them separately because they belong to separate years. So now, we have another Mishnah that says, Ha'orez v'hadochan v'hapargin v'hashumshamin. Now we're talking about legumes. We're talking about rice, millet, pargin, they translate as poppy, and shumshamin is sesame. Okay? So these are very small seed kinds of legumes. Shehishrishu lifnei Rosh HaShana misasran l'sha'avar umitaran bashvius, v'imlav asran bashvius umisasran l'shana haba. So when it comes to these legumes, now we have a fourth criterion, and that criterion is, it depends when the legume takes root in the soil. Not when you harvest it like vegetables, not when it grows a third of the way like wheat, grapes, and olives, but a totally different criterion is when it takes root in the soil. And so theoretically, you could have things planted right next to each other that take root at different times, so you have to know when everything takes root. So Amar Rabbanan, Ilan Basar Chanata, Tvu V'Zeisim Basar Shlish, Yerek Basar Lakita, Hani Kaman Shavino Rabbanan. So Rabba asks in amazement, he says, I don't understand, where did you get this criterion from? We've already stated that there are three different groups. One group is fruit that grows on trees, and that goes according to the chanata, that goes according to the budding of the fruit. Tvua and zeisim, wheat, grapes, and olives go according to a third of their growth. And vegetables go according to the time of harvest to determine what year it belongs to. So where does this come from? Where did you pulled this out of nowhere, right? Where did you get this new criterion of taking root? So Hadar Amar Rabba mitoch shasuin prachin azli rabbanan basar hashrasha. Rabba then said, you know what, I have an answer. My explanation is as follows. It's very easy. Really, the issue is over here. We're dealing here, everything that we're dealing with here, other than a grain, grapes, and olives, are all rabbinic tithes in the first place. You're only chayiv to take meiser and truma from these things midrabanan. And therefore the Chachamim had to use sensibility in determining what year it belongs to. When it comes to legumes, like these poppy seeds or sesame seeds, generally a farmer plants all of the field at the same time. And therefore they all take root at the same time. However, he harvests them typically in patches, in different stages. He'll harvest one day, he'll do this side of the field, the next day he'll do the next part of the field. And the problem is, since you're harvesting it over several days, the problem is that let's say you're harvesting it in the week of Rosh HaShana. So you'll harvest the first part of the field before Rosh HaShana, you'll harvest the second part of the field after Rosh HaShana, and you're going to be left with, if you're going to go after the harvest time, you're going to be left with a bunch of stuff that's going to be all mixed together, and it's going to be a problem. Because some of it will be from the previous year, some of it will be from the new year, and you're not going to be able to tithe it properly. So therefore the rabbi said, we have to be sensible about this. Since this is a rabbinic institution to begin with, let's be sensible and say, to avoid that problem, since they all take root at the same time, right? Generally, when you plant a field, they all takes root at the same time. So we'll say it goes according to the hashrasha, according to the taking root, and not according to the time of the harvest.
What do they call taking root? Like, what is the definition of taking root exactly?
I wish I could tell you precisely what it means, but my assumption would be when you see, like, you ever take something and put it in a bowl or a water with the toothpicks, when you see the tendrils growing out of the plant, that's when it's called taking root. I don't know how far the tendrils have to grow. Perhaps it's only a day's worth of growth, but at some point that's called taking root. So Amar Le Abaye.
Plastic cup, you would see it. And
right.
presumably in the ground you wouldn't know.
So Perhaps there is a way. Perhaps there is a way. Like you'd have to experiment. You pull out one of the plants out of the ground, and you'd see. Amar le Abaye. So Abaye says, the Yitzpor Garnu l'socho v'nim satar min achadash shabo l'achadash shabo min hayashin shabo l'yashin shabo. So Abaye asks a very simple question. He says, I don't understand what the problem is. Why did the Chachamim have to come up with the solution of going according to the time of taking root? Even if they went according to the time of the harvest, and some of it was harvested before Rosh HaShana, some of it after Rosh HaShana, what's the big deal? Mix all the seeds together after you've harvested, right? And you'll have a proportionate mixture of the tithe from whatever exists in the larger yield. So therefore, in other words, because since sesame seeds mix very well, poppy seeds mix very well, if you have, let's say, 30% of your harvest is from the old, and 70% of the harvest is from the new, and you mix it all together, and you take a scoop of 10% for your meiser, then 30% of that scoop will be from the old, and 70% will be from the new as well. And what's the big deal? That'll work, right? He says, Milo Tanya, Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur, Omer Mishum Reb Shimon Shazuri, Pul HaMitzri Shazaru Lezera, Mixaso Hishrush Lifnei Rosh HaShana, or Mixaso Hishrush La'achar Rosh HaShana, Ein Tormun HaMa'asrin Mizeh Al Zeh, Lefish Ein Tormun HaMa'asrin Lo Min HaChadash Lo Yashma Lo Min Yashin Lo HaChadash. So because we know that Reb Shimon Shazuri was quoted as saying as follows, the Egyptian bean, which is a type of legume, okay? So if you planted some of the plants, and the purpose of the plant is to harvest the future beans that are growing from the plant. If you planted some of it before Rosh Hashanah, and you planted some of it after Rosh Hashanah, and some of it took root before Rosh Hashanah, some of it took root after Rosh Hashanah, so you're not allowed to take the beans that grew before Rosh Hashanah and use that as your Trumas and Maestros for the stuff that grew after, and vice versa. So Ketzad Huosa, so what should you do, such Reb Shimon Shazuri? Sover Garnu L'Socho, V'dim Satar Mo Maser Min HaChadash Shabo L'Chadash Shabo Min HaYashin Shabo L'Yashin Shabo. So what's the solution? Very simple solution. Take all the beans after the entire field has been harvested, which has some chadash and some yashan, mix it all together very, very well, and therefore you can be assured that whatever proportions of chadash and yashan exist in the larger yield will also exist in that scoop of 10% that you're taking for your meiser. So you see that there's no reason why that shouldn't work. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why it's a problem. You know why it's a problem? Amar le Reb Shimon Shazuri Kamart, Reb Shimon Shazuri Savra, Yesh Bila, V'Rabbanan Savra Yein Bila. The answer is because Reb Shimon Shazuri holds of Bila. He holds that when you're dealing with legumes and dry things like that, which are very small, you can achieve homogeneity. You can homogenize it to the point where whatever mixture exists in the larger yield will also exist in any smaller sample, right? And therefore you can be assured of getting the proper measurements, the proper commensurate proportions in the meiser that you take. But that's only true according to Reb Shimon Shazuri. The Chachamim disagree and they say, no, you cannot be assured of a homogenization. You cannot be assured that you're going to get the exact same proportions in any one area of the mixture that exists out in the larger yield. And therefore they hold that you can't do that. So Amar Reb Yitzchak Bar Nachmeni, Amar Shmuel, Halacha Reb Yossi ben Kippur, Shema Mishum Reb Shimon Shazuri. Comes along Shmuel and says that I paskin like Reb Shimon Shazuri that you can achieve this homogenization, and therefore if you mix the legumes together from the chadash and the yashan, and you take a scoop of 10%, you'll have the same proportions that you have in the larger yield. So Maskefla Reb Zero, Mi Amar Shmuel Hachi, how could you tell me that Shmuel said that? V'ha'amar Shmuel lakol ein bila chutz miyayin v'shemen. Shmuel holds that you don't have homogenization when you mix things together unless you're mixing together fluids. He says when it comes to oil, let's say some of the oil is chadash and some of the oil is yashan, then you can achieve homogenization because it's liquid. It's all fluid. Same thing with wine. But anything that's dry, you have no guarantee of homogeneity, right? If that's the right word, right?
I can tell you practically, I've had a challenge doing that compounding.
Yeah, compounding. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Extremely difficult.
It's very, very difficult.
I have one parachute I've been doing for 12 years, and I spend hours just because it's, you know.
Yeah, because especially when doing pharmaceuticals, you have to be exactly precise. So, but the Gemara's question is, how can you tell me that Shmuel Paskin's like Reb Shimon Shazuri, who says you can homogenize properly with dry goods, when Shmuel says that homogenizing only works with liquids? So the Gemara answers, Ishtamitse ha da Amar Shmuel, ha kol holech achar gemar pri. Shmuel had made another statement to clarify. It's not that he holds like Reb Shimon Shizuri that dry goods can be homogenized. He disagrees with Reb Shimon Shizuri about that. But what he agrees is the end halacha, which is that if you have some beans took root before Rosh HaShana and some beans took root after Rosh HaShana, you can mix them together. It's no problem. You know why? Because Shmuel holds like another Tana who says that with beans you go according to the time of harvest, not the time of taking root. And therefore the beans that took root before Rosh Hashanah are also Chadash. They're also from the new year. Because even though they took root before Rosh Hashanah, if they weren't harvested until after Rosh Hashanah, it's all part of the Chadash, it's all part of the new year. That's what Shmuel meant to say. I hold like Reb Shimon Shizuri that you can mix the beans, not because I hold that you're homogenizing two different kinds, but because they're actually the same kind. Okay, utsricha. So now we have three statements of Shmuel, and now we're just going to take another minute to explain why Shmuel needed to make three statements instead of making one statement that would have given us the same clarity. Shmuel made three statements. Number one, he said the halacha is like Reb Shimon Shizuri. The second statement that Shmuel made is that you cannot achieve homogenization or homogeneity unless you're dealing with fluids. And the third statement that Shmuel made is that with legumes you go according to the harvest. Or he said, Hakol holech achar hapri, you go according to the harvest. Right? So what does this mean? So why did he need to make these three statements? I'll tell you why. Di'i ashminan halacha Reb Shimon Shizuri hava amina mishum de kasavar yesh bila kamash malan lechol ein bila. He needed to make this. If he would have only had the first statement that I paskin like Reb Shimon Shizuri, I might have thought it's because Shmuel holds you could homogenize dry goods. And that's not the case. Shmuel therefore has to tell you, no, you cannot homogenize unless you're dealing with fluids. And if I would have had only the second statement, that you cannot homogenize unless you're dealing with fluids, I might have thought that means he paskins like the Chachamim, that you cannot mix the beans from the old year that took root in the old year with the beans that took root in the new year. So kamashman halacha Reb Shimon Shizuri. Therefore he needs to tell me the halacha is like Reb Shimon Shizuri, that you can mix them, because I hold that you go according to the harvest. And if I would have only had the first two statements, then it would have seemed that Shmuel is contradicting himself. Because how can you paskin like Reb Shimon Shizuri and at the same time hold that ein bila, that you cannot homogenize dry goods? So kamashmal and hakol holech achar gemar pri. Therefore, he says the third statement to clarify that I go according to the harvest, not according to the taking root period, and that's why it's not a contradiction my first statement to my second statement. But if you would have only made the third statement that I hold that everything goes according to the harvest, I might have thought that's a little bit ambiguous. I might have thought that he means to say, even when it comes to the oraisa tithes of grain, grapes, and olives, that halacha is also the same. So kamash malan halacha Reb Shimon Shizuri b'may depolik. Therefore, he needs to tell me the halacha is like Reb Shimon Shizuri, meaning that only when it comes to legumes do I hold you go according to the harvest period, and not according to the taking root or according to the third of growth, like with other produce. So frak the Gemara v'lishmin and honey tarti la kolin bilo lamalis. But you only need therefore the first and third statement. In other words, just say I paskin like Reb Shimon Shizuri, and I hold that everything goes according to the time of harvest, and that's why I hold that you can mix the old legumes with the new legumes. So why do you have to say the second statement, which is that you cannot homogenize dry goods? What's the purpose? So the Gemara says, he wanted to tell me an incidental halacha that's related to this, which is, even though you cannot achieve homogenization with dry goods, you can homogenize liquids. So therefore, you need all three statements of Shmuel to get a comprehensive knowledge of what he's trying to convey. Have a wonderful day.
If the harvest straddles Rosh HaShana, then you can't mix them, correct?
According to, of what? Of legumes?
Yes.
So then according to Shmuel, you can. You are allowed to mix them, because it says, long as, you mean if the harvest?
Yeah.
Yes. If the harvest straddles Rosh Hashanah, then Shmuel would agree that you can't.